Now let me set the scene for you, because what I'm about to tell you sounds like something straight out of a movie. But the details, the circumstances, the sheer improbability of it all makes it even more gripping than any screenplay could ever be. Picture this, a seemingly ordinary pickup truck rolling down a stretch of highway on what appears to be just another day. Inside that truck, 5 men. 5 individuals who had made choices that led them down a very particular path in life. They were wanted, they were dangerous, they were part of a network that had been operating in the shadows for longer than most people would believe. And yet, on this day, on this highway, their journey was about to come to an abrupt and unexpected end. The FBI, acting on intelligence that had taken months to gather, made the decision to pull that truck over. The agents involved had no idea, not a single clue, that all 5 occupants of that vehicle were active members of organized criminal operations. They didn't know they were about to intercept 5 gangsters in one fell swoop. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The entire arrest happened without a single punch thrown, without a shot fired, without any of the chaos you might expect when law enforcement encounters individuals of this caliber. Every single one of them was taken into custody without any effort, without resistance, without the kind of dramatic confrontation that usually defines these moments. How does that happen? How do 5 people with everything to lose, people who had built their lives around evading capture, simply surrender without a fight? That's the question we're going to answer today, and I promise you, the journey to that answer is going to take us through twists and turns you won't see coming. Let's rewind a bit and talk about how this all began, because nothing in this story happened by accident. The investigation that led to this highway stop had been building for years. Federal agents had been tracking patterns, following leads that seemed insignificant on their own, but started forming a picture when pieced together. There were financial transactions that didn't add up, movements of people and resources that followed suspicious timelines, whispers from informants who risked everything to share what they knew. The FBI had been watching, waiting, building a case that would eventually become airtight. But even with all that preparation, even with all those months of surveillance and intelligence gathering, they couldn't have predicted that a routine traffic stop based on a separate matter entirely would lead them straight to 5 high-value targets all at once. The agents who made that stop were following protocol. They had reason to pull the vehicle over, something technical, something that gave them legal grounds to approach. When they activated their lights and signaled for the truck to pull over, they were expecting maybe one person of interest, maybe a lead that would take them further up the chain. They weren't expecting to find the entire chain sitting right there in front of them. The truck pulled over without incident. No speeding away, no attempt to flee, nothing that would indicate the occupants were anything other than regular people dealing with a traffic violation. The agents approached with standard caution, the kind of measured alertness that comes from years of training and experience. The driver rolled down the window. The agents asked for identification, and that's when things started to click into place. The name on the license matched a name in the federal database. Not just matched, it lit up like a Christmas tree. The agent taking the information kept his composure, didn't let on that anything was unusual, but internally, alarms were going off. He stepped back to the vehicle, conferred quietly with his partner, and they made the decision to ask everyone in the truck to step out. This is standard procedure in situations where there's a potential concern, but neither agent was prepared for what the background checks were about to reveal. As each occupant exited the vehicle and provided their identification, the database hits kept coming. One after another after another. 5 names, 5 records, 5 individuals who were each, in their own right, persons of interest in ongoing federal investigations. The odds of this happening, the statistical improbability of 5 wanted individuals all being in the same vehicle at the same time, getting pulled over together, it was astronomical. Now here's where the human element of this story becomes absolutely fascinating, because we have to ask ourselves, what was going through the minds of those 5 men in those moments? They knew who they were. They knew what they'd done. They knew that their names were in systems, that people were looking for them, that their freedom depended on staying invisible. And yet, when confronted by federal agents, when the moment came to make a choice between resistance and surrender, they chose surrender. All 5 of them, unanimously, without discussion, without protest, without any of the bravado that you might expect from individuals who had built reputations in dangerous circles. Were they tired? Had they reached a point where the constant looking over the shoulder, the perpetual state of vigilance, had worn them down to nothing? Or was it something else entirely? Was it a calculation, a cold, rational assessment that resistance would only make things worse, that their best chance at any kind of future, even one behind bars, was to cooperate in that moment? We may never fully know what went through their minds, but the fact remains that when those handcuffs went on, not a single one of them resisted. Not physically, not verbally, not in any way that would escalate the situation. The agents, for their part, were professional throughout the entire encounter. They had been trained for high-stress situations, for moments when things could go sideways in an instant, but they also knew the value of calm authority, of projecting control without aggression. When you're dealing with individuals who might be armed, who might be desperate, the last thing you want to do is create a situation that forces them into a corner where violence seems like the only option. The agents spoke clearly, gave direct instructions, maintained visual contact with all 5 men at all times, and ensured that every step of the arrest process followed protocol to the letter. This wasn't just about making arrests. It was about making arrests that would stand up in court, that would be defensible under scrutiny, that wouldn't give defense attorneys any ammunition to claim improper procedure or rights violations. And they succeeded. Every single step, from the initial stop to the final transport to federal custody, was documented, witnessed, and executed flawlessly. As word of the arrest spread through the relevant federal agencies, the response was a mixture of disbelief and celebration. Disbelief because nobody could quite believe that such a significant group of targets had been apprehended all at once, in a single stop, without any advance warning that they'd all be together. Celebration, because this kind of simultaneous arrest would save months, maybe years of additional investigation. When you're tracking organized criminal activity, one of the biggest challenges is coordination. These networks are specifically designed to be compartmentalized, to ensure that if one person gets caught, they can't bring down the entire operation. But when you get multiple high-level individuals at the same time, the amount of intelligence you can gather, the connections you can map, the operations you can disrupt, it multiplies exponentially. Each of those 5 men knew different pieces of the puzzle. Each had connections to different aspects of the operation. Each had information that, when combined with what the others knew, would paint a complete picture of an enterprise that had been operating successfully for years. The interrogations that followed were methodical and extensive. Federal investigators knew they had a limited window to gather information before lawyers got involved, before the men had time to coordinate their stories, before the organization they were part of could adapt to the loss of these key players. The investigators worked around the clock, building timelines, cross-referencing statements, identifying contradictions and confirmations. What emerged from those interrogations was a portrait of an operation that was far more sophisticated than many had realized. These weren't street-level operators. These were individuals who understood logistics, who knew how to move resources across jurisdictions, who had built relationships with people in positions that gave them advantages. They'd been successful not because they were the most violent or the most intimidating, but because they were smart, organized, and patient. They played the long game. They avoided unnecessary attention. They made calculated risks and generally came out ahead. Until this one day, when a confluence of circumstances brought their entire operation to a standstill. One of the most intriguing aspects of this case was the relationship between the 5 men themselves. They weren't all equal partners. There was a hierarchy, a structure that determined who made decisions and who followed orders. But despite those differences in status, they had developed a degree of trust that's rare in criminal enterprises. They trusted each other enough to travel together, to be in the same vehicle, despite the obvious security risks that created. In their world, consolidating like that went against every rule of operational security. It created a single point of failure. And yet they did it anyway, which suggests either a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance or circumstances that forced them together despite the risks. The investigation would eventually reveal which it was, but in those first hours after the arrest, it was one of the many questions that needed answering. The highway where this all went down had been the scene of countless traffic stops over the years. Thousands of vehicles passed through every day, carrying people going about their ordinary lives, completely unaware that history, in its small way, was being made in that very spot. The agents who made that stop will probably remember it for the rest of their careers. It's the kind of moment that validates all the training, all the long hours, all the tedious work that goes into building cases and following leads. It's a reminder that sometimes, despite all the planning and preparation, success comes down to being in the right place at the right time, being alert enough to recognize an opportunity when it presents itself, and being professional enough to capitalize on it without letting the moment overwhelm you. For the prosecutors who would eventually handle the case, this arrest was a gift. Having all 5 defendants in custody simultaneously meant they could be tried together, which would streamline the legal process and ensure consistent application of justice. The evidence gathered from the vehicle, from personal effects, from electronic devices, all of it could be authenticated and presented in court with a clear chain of custody. Defense attorneys would have limited room to maneuver, limited opportunities to claim that evidence had been tampered with or that rights had been violated. The case was as solid as cases get, built on a foundation of proper procedure and overwhelming documentation. But beyond the legal implications, beyond the operational victories and the intelligence gathered, this story raises profound questions about choice and consequence, about the paths people take and the moments when those paths come to an end. Each of those 5 men had made decisions, day after day, year after year, that led them to be in that truck on that highway on that particular day. Each had opportunities to make different choices, to take different paths. And yet they didn't. They continued forward, deeper into a lifestyle that they must have known couldn't last forever. Criminal enterprises always end. The only questions are when and how. For these 5, the end came on a highway, in handcuffs, without violence, without drama, without any of the chaos that might have been expected. In a way, they were fortunate. They were arrested by professionals who treated them with the dignity that the law requires, who followed procedure, who ensured their rights were protected even as those rights were being exercised to take away their freedom. They could have ended up in a shootout. They could have ended up casualties of their own choices. Instead, they ended up in custody, alive, with access to legal representation, with the opportunity to face justice in a system that, for all its flaws, at least pretends to fairness. The community that these men came from, the network of associates and family members and friends who knew them in various capacities. They would have heard about the arrest through the grapevine, through phone calls and whispered conversations. Some would have been shocked. Others would have seen it as inevitable. When you live a life outside the law, arrest is always a possibility, always hanging over you like a storm cloud that might break at any moment. The question is never if, but when. For these 5 men, the when had arrived, and the how turned out to be remarkably mundane, lacking the dramatic flair that movies and television have conditioned us to expect from such moments. Real life is like that. The most significant moments often happen quietly, without fanfare, without soundtrack, without any indication that something important is occurring beyond the immediate circumstances. In the days and weeks that followed the arrest, the investigation expanded. Other arrests were made, assets were seized. The full scope of the operation began to reveal itself, like a photograph slowly developing in a dark room. Each new piece of information confirmed suspicions, answered questions, and sometimes raised new ones. The 5 men in that truck were important, but they weren't the entire story. They were chapters in a much longer book, one that law enforcement had been reading piecemeal for years and was finally beginning to understand in its totality. The arrests didn't end the criminal enterprise completely. Networks like that are resilient. They adapt, restructure, find new leadership. But they were dealt a significant blow, one that would take time to recover from, if they recovered at all. And in that time, other investigations would continue, other leads would be followed, other arrests would be made. The work of law enforcement is never finished. It's a constant process of action and reaction, of staying one step ahead when possible and catching up when necessary. For the agents involved, there was satisfaction in a job well done, but also an understanding that this was just one victory in a much longer war. They would celebrate briefly, accept the commendations, and then move on to the next case, the next investigation, the next challenge. That's the nature of the work. Success is measured not in single arrests, but in the cumulative impact of many arrests, many investigations, many small victories that add up over time to make communities safer and hold people accountable for their choices. The 5 men in that truck would face their day in court. They would have attorneys who would argue on their behalf, who would look for any procedural error, any violation of rights, any reason why the evidence should be excluded or the charges dismissed. That's their right, and it's a crucial part of the system. But barring some unforeseen development, barring some massive mistake by investigators or prosecutors, they would be convicted. The evidence was too strong, the case too well built, the circumstances too clear, and they would serve time removed from society, paying the price that society has decided is appropriate for the choices they made. And that's where we find ourselves at the end of this story, looking at a single moment in time when 5 lives changed forever, when months of investigation paid off in unexpected ways, when a routine traffic stop became anything but routine. It's a story about preparation meeting opportunity, about the mundane mechanics of law enforcement producing extraordinary results, about choices and consequences playing out on a stretch of highway that had seen countless other stories, but none quite like this one. It's a reminder that justice, when it works properly, doesn't always look like the movies. Sometimes it's quiet, sometimes it's almost anticlimactic. Sometimes it happens without anyone noticing except the people directly involved. But it happens nonetheless, and in happening, it reaffirms the idea that actions have consequences, that society has rules, and that those rules apply to everyone regardless of who they are or what kind of reputation they've built. What do you think about all this? Does it surprise you that 5 wanted individuals would surrender without any resistance? Have you ever thought about the split-second decisions that define entire lives, the moments when everything changes and there's no going back? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I genuinely want to hear what you're thinking about this. And if you want, tell me from which corner of the world you're watching this video. Your comment matters, and I want to read it and reply to you. For more exciting stories like this one, click on the video that's appearing on your screen right now.